The anomaly had no name in any Federation database because no Federation database had ever cataloged this region of space. One moment, the USS Enterprise E was completing a diplomatic courier run through the Briar Patch, and the next, Lieutenant Commander Data was reporting something that should have been physically impossible. A subspace fold of such magnitude that the ship had been displaced not merely across light years, but across what appeared to be a fundamental boundary between cosmological structures. Captain Jean-Luc Picard stood at the center of his bridge and absorbed the information with the stillness of a man who had faced the Borg, survived assimilation, and negotiated peace between species who had been killing each other for centuries. He did not panic. He assessed. Data, give me something I can work with. The stars, Captain. Data's golden fingers moved across his console with mechanical precision. Their spectral signatures, positions, and proper motion vectors correspond to no known region of our galaxy. However, the physical laws governing this space appear identical to our own. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, all consistent. We are in a different galaxy, but not a different universe. Small mercies, Worf said from Tactical, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a Klingon who refused to show alarm. Counselor Troy stepped forward from her station, her dark eyes moving to the view screen, where an unfamiliar star field burned cold and indifferent. Captain, I'm already sensing something. Even at this distance. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Not a gesture of pain, but concentration. There are billions of minds out there, and beneath the ordinary texture of thought and feeling, fear. Organized, widespread fear. Picard turned back to the view screen. Geordi, what do long-range sensors show? LaForge's implants flickered as he processed the incoming data. Sir, I'm picking up multiple inhabited systems within 50 light-years. Most are pre-warp, but... He paused. Wait. Correction. Several systems are showing energy signatures consistent with faster-than-light travel. Hyperdrive, from the look of it. Different mechanism than warp, but the energy output is unambiguous. These people have FTL. The word landed on the bridge with weight, because every officer present knew exactly what it meant. The Prime Directive, Starfleet's most absolute law, the non-interference doctrine that governed contact with developing civilizations, contained one foundational threshold: warp capability. A civilization that had crossed that boundary had demonstrated the capacity to encounter the wider universe on its own terms. They were no longer protected from contact. They were, by definition, peers. Picard clasped his hands behind his back. Then the Prime Directive does not apply. The nearest inhabited system with FTL signatures, Data reported, appears to be approximately 12 light-years distant. I am also detecting what appears to be a large formation of vessels in high orbit around a planet in the system directly ahead. The configuration is military. The planet itself reads as heavily populated, temperate, and non-militarized. He paused, which for Data meant something. Captain, I am detecting weapons charging aboard the orbital vessels. They are not targeting us. They are targeting the planet. Picard moved to his command chair and sat with the deliberate calm of a man making a decision he had already made. Hail them. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The view screen shifted from stars to static, then resolved into something none of them had seen before. A wide, pale face, beneath an elaborate alien headdress, eyes calculating behind a veneer of bureaucratic contempt. Viceroy Newt Gunray stared at the Federation officers with an expression that cycled rapidly from surprise to suspicion to barely concealed hostility. This is, who are you? You are not Republic. Your vessel is not on any registry. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets. Picard kept his voice level, almost gentle, the voice he used when he wanted someone to believe he was less dangerous than he was. We have arrived in your region of space under unexpected circumstances and are conducting peaceful first contact. I note that your vessels appear to be in a threatening posture relative to the planet below. I would very much like to understand the situation before it develops further. Gunray's mouth opened and closed. Whatever response protocol the Trade Federation had for unexpected alien warships of unknown origin materializing in the middle of a blockade operation, It apparently did not include a prepared script. He muted the channel. Troy leaned toward Picard and spoke quietly. He's frightened of us, but there's something else. He's frightened of something behind him. Someone he's more afraid of than us. Picard filed that away. Data spoke without turning from his console. Captain, while the channel was open, I was able to partially scan the Trade Federation vessel's communication traffic. Their encryption is robust, but not beyond our capability to analyze given time. I am already detecting layered transmissions, some consistent with standard commercial operation, others utilizing a secondary encryption protocol of considerably greater sophistication. Someone is talking to them from somewhere else, Picard said. Yes, Captain. And whoever it is, they initiated the encrypted channel 17 minutes before we arrived. The timing suggests we interrupted something. On the view screen, Gunray reappeared, his composure partially reassembled. Captain Picard, the Trade Federation is conducting a legal commercial dispute with the sovereign government of Naboo. This is an internal matter of the Galactic Republic and does not concern outside parties. Picard looked at the formation of battleships hovering over a green and blue world that had done nothing to deserve them. And he thought of every civilization he had ever watched be destroyed from the inside out by the corruption of those meant to protect it. I see, he said pleasantly. Then you won't mind if we observe. The planet Naboo resolved on the Enterprise's view screen like something from a painter's imagination, swirling greens and blues, interrupted by the silver threads of vast river systems, cloud formations that caught the system's sun and held it in long amber bands across the Terminator line. It was, by any objective measure, beautiful. Data noted its beauty in the same breath he noted its defensive capabilities, which were minimal, and its population density, which was concentrated in several large urban centers that would be catastrophically vulnerable to orbital bombardment. Picard noted both things simultaneously and ordered the Enterprise to a position between the Trade Federation fleet and the planet below. It was not an aggressive maneuver, technically. The Enterprise made no weapons lock, raised no shields beyond passive deflectors, and transmitted no threatening communication. It simply moved, with the quiet authority of a sovereign-class starship that massed considerably more than anything the Trade Federation had deployed, and occupied the space where any weapons fire from those battleships would have to pass through a Federation hull before reaching Naboo. Gunray, monitoring from his command ship, did not fire. He was many things, Picard suspected, but he was not stupid. Data, what can you tell me about the government of this planet? Naboo operates under an elected monarchy, Captain. The current queen, designated Amidala, appears to be quite young. My analysis of intercepted public communications suggests she is approximately 14 years of age. The planet is a member of the Galactic Republic, which appears to be a democratic federation of thousands of star systems governed by a senate on the planet Coruscant. Data paused. The structural similarities to our own federation are considerable, though the Republic appears to be significantly older and considerably more politically complex. Hail the planet. The response came faster than Picard expected. The face that appeared on the view screen was extraordinary. White painted, elaborately costumed, composed with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned very young that showing uncertainty was a luxury she could not afford. Queen Amidala of Naboo looked at Picard with dark eyes that were simultaneously the eyes of a teenager and something considerably older. Beside her stood a Gungan in an officer's uniform. Two handmaidens whose stillness suggested combat training beneath the ceremonial role, and a blue-skinned protocol droid that immediately began cataloging languages. It found none that matched. Your Highness, Picard said, inclining his head with the precise degree of respect he afforded heads of state. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. We represent the United Federation of Planets, which I suspect you have not previously encountered. We arrived in your region of space recently and find ourselves concerned by the situation in your orbit. I want to be direct with you. We have placed our vessel between the Trade Federation fleet and your planet, and we intend to remain there. The Queen's painted face did not change expression, but Troy made a small sound beside Picard, barely audible. What is it? He murmured. She's relieved, Troy said quietly. Genuinely, profoundly relieved. She's been afraid for days. But there's something else. The woman standing to her left, one of the handmaidens. Troy's brow furrowed. She's not reading like a handmaiden. Picard stored that information in the same mental drawer as Gunray's layered fear and moved forward. "Captain Picard," the Queen said, and her voice carried the careful modulation of formal training over genuine emotion. "The Trade Federation has established an illegal blockade of our planet under the pretext of a trade dispute. We have been unable to communicate with the Galactic Senate. Our transmissions are being jammed." She paused. "You appear to have circumvented that jamming. We have considerably more powerful communication arrays than you may be accustomed to," Picard said. "With your permission, I would like to open a channel to your Senate on your behalf." Something moved behind the Queen's painted stillness. A decision being made. "You have our permission, Captain." "Data," Picard said. Data's fingers were already moving. The jamming the Trade Federation had deployed against Naboo's communications was sophisticated by the standards of this galaxy, Picard suspected. Against Enterprise's comm systems, it was the technological equivalent of trying to stop a flood with a paper cup. The channel to Coruscant opened in 40 seconds. What came back was not encouraging. A Senate aide, not a senator. Bureaucratic deflection. Assurances that the matter was being discussed in committee. Picard listened with the patience of a diplomat and the attention of a man who had spent decades learning to hear what was not being said. And what he heard in the spaces between the aide's careful words was the sound of machinery turning, slow, deliberate, pre-planned machinery that had been set in motion long before any blockade ship took its position. He closed the channel. "Counselor," he said, "when we were receiving that transmission from Coruscant, what were you sensing?" Troy had gone very still. It was the stillness she wore when something had genuinely disturbed her, and in Picard's experience, it took considerable disturbance to produce it. "Fear from Naboo, Captain." Confusion and genuine concern from several of the Senate contacts Data rerouted through. But from whoever was managing the routing of our call, she stopped. "Troy." "Satisfaction," she said. "Someone on Coruscant received word that this blockade has reached crisis level, and their dominant emotional response was satisfaction." The bridge was quiet for a moment. "Data," Picard said. "I want everything you can pull from Trade Federation communications, encrypted or otherwise. I want to know who they're talking to, what they're being promised, and who benefits if this planet is occupied." "Already compiling, Captain." However, Data turned from his console, and his golden face held an expression, but occupied the same emotional territory. "Captain, I am detecting something within the Trade Federation communication architecture that I did not initially flag because I could not initially categorize it. There is a second layer of encrypted transmission running beneath their standard command channel. It is not commercial encryption. It is not military encryption, as this galaxy appears to practice it." He paused. "It is something else entirely. The mathematical structure suggests extreme age and deliberate obfuscation by someone with a sophisticated understanding of signal theory." Worf straightened at tactical. "Someone is giving the Trade Federation orders from a channel they themselves may not fully understand." "That is a reasonable inference, Commander." Picard stood and walked to the view screen, where Naboo hung green and fragile against the dark, and the Trade Federation fleet held its position at a respectful distance from a Federation starship whose capabilities it could not fully assess. He looked at the planet and thought about satisfaction, about pre-planned machinery, about hidden channels old enough to predate the encryption standards of an entire civilization. "Red alert," he said quietly, "not because I intend to fire on anyone, because I want every system on this ship at full readiness." He turned back to his crew. Something considerably larger than a trade dispute brought those ships here. "I want to know what it is before tomorrow." Data did not sleep. This was, in the context of the current situation, an operational advantage that Picard had quietly come to rely upon in the same way a general relies upon high ground. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the steady confidence of someone who knows the terrain is working in his favor. By the time the Enterprise's night cycle had passed its midpoint and the crew rotated through rest schedules, Data had processed 11 hours of Trade Federation communication traffic, cross-referenced it against every political, commercial, and military database the Enterprise carried, constructed a probabilistic model of the blockade's chain of command, and arrived at conclusions that he waited until 0600 ship's time to present, because he had learned over years of serving with humans that delivering catastrophic intelligence findings in the middle of the night produced worse decision-making then delivering them over coffee. Picard arrived on the bridge with a cup of Earl Grey and the expression of a man who had slept 4 hours and considered it adequate. Troy arrived simultaneously, which suggested she had sensed something from Data's direction even in sleep. Worf was already at tactical, because Worf was always already at tactical. "Report," Picard said. Data stood at the center of the bridge and presented his findings with the clean, unhurried precision of a mind that processed at speeds no organic brain could match, organizing weeks of layered deception into a sequence that a human could follow without losing the thread. The Trade Federation, he explained, was not acting autonomously. The blockade of Naboo was not a commercial dispute that had escalated beyond its originator's intentions. It was a constructed crisis, assembled with deliberate care over a period of months, possibly years, by parties who understood the Republic Senate's procedural mechanisms well enough to predict exactly how it would respond. Who would be appointed to mediate, what political capital would be spent, and what the net result would be in terms of power redistribution at the highest levels of galactic governance. The secondary encrypted channel, Data continued, carries transmissions from a single source. That source uses a voice modulator that obscures all biological identification markers: species, age, gender, health status. The modulator is sophisticated enough that I cannot determine with certainty whether I am analyzing a humanoid, a droid, or a synthesized construct. He paused. However, the vocabulary, sentence construction, and strategic framing of the communications are consistent with someone of exceptional education, long-term political experience, and what I can only describe as a philosopher's relationship with power. This individual does not give orders in the conventional sense. They provide frameworks, contexts, they describe the shape of desired outcomes, and leave the methodology to Gunray. "They're careful," Troy said. "Someone who's been careful for a very long time." "Yes, Counselor." The encrypted channel also contains references to a second party, a field operative described only as my apprentice. This operative appears to have direct presence in the region and is expected to take physical action at a specific trigger point. Data brought up a star chart on the main view screen, overlaid with signal routing traces that map the transmission paths like the threads of a spider's web. Most significantly, I have been able to trace the origin point of the transmissions with reasonable confidence. The star chart shifted. A single world pulsed at its center, dense, layered with city lights that covered every continent, a planet that from orbit would look like a glowing ember. "Coruscant," Picard said. "Yes, Captain." The transmissions originate from Coruscant and are routed through no fewer than 7 relay points before reaching the Trade Federation command ship. The routing is designed to be untraceable by any communication technology this galaxy currently employs. Data looked at Picard with his golden, unblinking eyes. It was not designed to be untraceable by ours. Picard set down his tea. Worf spoke from tactical, his voice carrying the particular weight of a warrior recognizing a battlefield. "Someone in the Republic's government is orchestrating this blockade, using the Trade Federation as a proxy force. That is the most conservative interpretation of the available data." "Yes," Data said. "A less conservative interpretation would note that the scope and sophistication of this operation and the explicit references within the transmissions to Senate procedural outcomes, emergency powers provisions, and long-term political restructuring suggest that the blockade of Naboo is not the objective. It is a mechanism, a means of producing a specific political crisis at the Senate level, the resolution of which has been pre-engineered to benefit the transmission source." End quote. The bridge absorbed this in silence. Picard stood and walked to the view screen, where Naboo still turned below them, and the Trade Federation fleet still held its distance. He looked at the planet and thought about what Data had just described. Not a corrupt official taking a bribe, not a corporation overreaching its authority, but something architectural, something patient, the kind of plan that required its architect to have been in position for years, accumulating influence with the careful discipline of someone who understood that power built slowly was power that lasted. Data. In your analysis of the political structure of the Galactic Republic, who benefits most from a crisis that requires the invocation of emergency powers? Data did not hesitate. Emergency powers provisions in the Republic's Constitution vest extraordinary authority in the office of the Supreme Chancellor during periods of existential crisis. The current Supreme Chancellor is a senator from Naboo named Palpatine, who was elected to the position on a platform of reform and was notably supported by cross-party consensus despite having no obvious political enemies. Data paused. His political profile is, in many respects, anomalous. He appears to have cultivated relationships across every major Senate faction simultaneously, which is statistically unusual for a politician operating in a system with as many competing interests as the Republic Senate. No enemies, Picard said quietly. In a political system that complex, he turned from the view screen. A man with no enemies either has no principles or has very carefully hidden them. There is another data point, Data said. The encrypted transmissions from Coruscant began 17 months ago. Chancellor Palpatine assumed his current office 16 months ago. The number hung in the recycled air of the bridge. The crisis that brought him to power, Worf said slowly, was manufactured by the same communication architecture that is currently directing the Trade Federation blockade, Data confirmed. I cannot prove this with absolute certainty, but the mathematical probability that the signal routing infrastructure was constructed for one operation and then coincidentally repurposed for another is negligible, Picard said. Yes, Captain. Picard turned to face his crew fully, and what they saw in his expression was not shock or alarm, but something colder and more purposeful. The look of a man who had just had a very large picture come into very sharp focus and was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The Prime Directive does not apply here, he said, not for the first time, but now with a different weight behind it. And I will not stand by while a civilization is consumed from within by someone who has been engineering its destruction from the inside. He looked at Troy. What is your read on Naboo's queen? Principled, Troy said without hesitation. Genuinely committed to her people, and far more politically sophisticated than her age would suggest. Then she deserves to know what's happening to her planet and why. Picard moved toward his command chair. Hail Queen Amidala. And Data, I want everything compiled into a format a head of state can present to a legislative body. Evidence chains, signal intercepts, probability assessments. All of it. Understood, Captain. One more thing. Picard paused. That reference to an apprentice. A field operative expected to take physical action. Yes, Captain. Find them. The signal was old. Not old in the way that bureaucratic encryption aged. Accumulated patches and legacy code producing digital archaeology that Data could read like sediment layers. This was old in a way that registered differently, that made Data pause in a manner so brief only Geordi would have noticed it. A processing hesitation of 0.003 seconds that in human terms would not exist, but in Data's internal experience represented something close to what his colleagues might call unease. He ran the analysis again. The mathematical structure underlying the secondary encrypted channel was not merely sophisticated, it was ancient. The encryption architecture predated the Trade Federation by centuries. It predated, as best Data could determine by cross-referencing the fragmentary historical databases he had been building from intercepted Republic communications, the current form of the Galactic Republic itself. Someone had constructed this communication methodology during a period of galactic history that the Republic's own records described in terms that Data could only categorize as deliberately obscured, references to ancient conflict, to a war between philosophical factions of practitioners of something called the Force, to a resolution that the victorious side had apparently chosen to describe as the permanent elimination of the losing faction. Data noted that civilizations which permanently eliminated their enemies rarely described the elimination accurately. He brought his findings to Picard in the captain's ready room, where Picard was reviewing Data's compiled intelligence package and occasionally pausing to look out the viewport at Naboo below, with the expression of a man who kept finding the picture larger than the frame. The Force, Picard said, reading the section Data had flagged. An energy field of some kind, Captain, apparently pervasive throughout this galaxy and accessible to certain individuals with a specific biological characteristic. Midi-chlorians, microscopic organisms present in living cells that appear to serve as an interface between organic life and this field. Individuals with sufficient concentrations of these organisms can, according to every historical and contemporary record I have accessed, manipulate physical reality through their connection to this field. Telekinesis, precognition, enhanced physical capability. In extreme cases, what the records describe as lightning generated from the practitioner's own body. Picard set down the pad. You're describing people with genuine paranormal abilities. I am describing people whose abilities would appear paranormal by Federation standards, but are apparently consistent, reproducible, and biologically grounded within the context of this galaxy's physics. The Jedi Order is the primary organization of Force practitioners, currently active in the Republic. They serve as peacekeepers and advisors. Data paused. There was historically a second organization, the Sith. According to Republic records, the Sith were destroyed approximately 1,000 years ago, and you don't believe they were. The encrypted communication channel, Captain, uses an encryption architecture that appears in fragmentary historical records as Sith in origin. The individual using it refers to themselves in the transmissions, using titles and frameworks consistent with Sith philosophy, as described in those same records. Data's golden eyes met Picard's, with the particular quality of directness he reserved for information he considered operationally critical. The individual directing the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo, the individual who appears to have engineered the political crisis that elevated Sheev Palpatine to the chancellorship, is in all probability a practitioner of the Sith tradition, and the reference to an apprentice suggests they are not operating alone. Picard was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Naboo turned. "The Jedi don't know," he said. "I find no evidence in any intercepted communication that the Jedi Order has identified this threat. Their own transmissions, which I have been monitoring since we established communication with the planet, suggest they are aware of the Trade Federation blockade as a political matter, but have not connected it to a deeper conspiracy." Data folded his hands. "Captain, there is an additional element. Of course there is. The reference to the apprentice as a field operative expected to take physical action. I have been attempting to identify this individual's location and intended target. Cross-referencing the transmission content with Republic navigation data and shipping manifests, I believe the apprentice is currently in transit toward this system. The transmissions contain references to a specific target described only as the Chosen One, a phrase with significant resonance in Jedi theological tradition, referring to a prophesized individual of extraordinary force sensitivity who is expected to bring balance to this energy field. Picard leaned forward. "They're not coming for Naboo. Naboo is the mechanism, Captain. The blockade creates a crisis that draws specific individuals into motion. Republic negotiators, Jedi peacekeepers. And among the individuals those Jedi are likely to encounter during any intervention on Naboo or in the surrounding region is a 9-year-old child on the desert planet Tatooine named Anakin Skywalker, whose midi-chlorian count, according to fragmentary Jedi records I have been able to access, is described as higher than any previously recorded. Higher, the records note, than the Jedi Order's own founding masters. The ready room was very quiet. "They want the child," Picard said. "The transmissions do not specify capture or elimination. They specify control. The word used translates most accurately as asset. The Chosen One is described as an asset to be secured before the Jedi can claim him." Data paused. Given the Sith's apparent philosophy of power through domination, and given that this child's potential appears to represent a generational event in terms of force capability, I believe securing him means turning him, cultivating him over years toward a specific purpose. Picard stood. He walked to the viewport and looked at Naboo, and thought about a 9-year-old child on a desert planet who had no idea that someone had been building an architecture of manipulation around his future since before he was old enough to understand what the future was. He thought about what Troy had said. Satisfaction from someone on Coruscant when the crisis deepened. He thought about a man with no political enemies who had been Supreme Chancellor for 16 months, and about an encryption methodology that was 1,000 years old, and about the peculiar patience required to build a plan that would take decades to execute. Worf's voice came over the comm. "Captain, the Trade Federation fleet is repositioning. They appear to be moving into a formation consistent with planetary invasion. Landing craft are being prepared in the lower bays of the command ship." "On my way." Picard moved toward the door, then stopped. "Data. One question. Captain, this individual on Coruscant, Palpatine, if he is what you believe him to be, If he has abilities consistent with what these records describe, what are we dealing with? Data considered the question with the full weight of every historical record he had processed in the past 11 hours. We are dealing, Captain, with someone who has been playing a very long game. Someone who has placed themselves at the center of power in a civilization of trillions, who has done so without attracting suspicion, who has contingency plans for contingencies, and who views organic life on a scale of utility. He paused. In my assessment, he is the most dangerous individual we have encountered since the Borg Queen, with one significant difference, which is, the Borg Queen wanted to assimilate the galaxy. This individual wants to own it. Picard walked onto his bridge and looked at the Trade Federation fleet, moving into invasion formation above a planet that had done nothing to deserve any of this, and he felt the particular clarity that came to him in moments when the right course of action was also the hard one. Battle stations, he said, and get me Queen Amidala. The Lucrehulk-class battleship was, by the engineering standards of its era, an impressive vessel, 3 kilometers in diameter, converted from a commercial freighter chassis into a weapons platform with the particular gracelessness of a design that had been built for profit and retrofitted for war. Its droid control systems could coordinate hundreds of thousands of battle droids simultaneously. Its defensive shields were rated against the heaviest weapons the Republic's small peacekeeping fleet could deploy. It carried enough firepower to reduce a city to rubble from orbit and enough landing craft to put an army on the ground within hours. Against a Sovereign-class starship from the 24th century, it was a barge with guns. Picard understood this. He did not enjoy it precisely. There was nothing enjoyable about the application of force, in his experience, and the gap between what the Enterprise could do and what the Trade Federation could withstand made the encounter less a battle than a demonstration. But he had learned long ago that the most merciful application of overwhelming force was a swift one, because prolonged conflicts gave fear and desperation time to produce atrocities, and he had seen enough atrocities to know their cost. He gave Gunray one chance. "Viceroy," he said, from the command chair, with the full visual of the Enterprise's bridge behind him and the full weight of everything Data had compiled in the hours preceding this moment, pressing against his carefully maintained diplomatic tone. "I am going to say this once, clearly, so that there is no possibility of misunderstanding. I know who gave you your orders. I know the channel they used. I know what you were promised, and what the actual plan is for your organization once you have served your purpose in it." He paused to let that settle. "Stand down your invasion fleet. Withdraw your vessels from Naboo's orbit. Do this now, and I will ensure that your testimony regarding the individual who directed this operation is heard by the appropriate authorities. Refuse, and I will disable your fleet, and your testimony becomes considerably less relevant." Gunray stared at him from the view screen. Behind the Neimoidian's pale face, Picard could see the specific calculation of a man weighing 2 different kinds of fear against each other. Fear of the unknown vessel blocking his path, and fear of something he considered more certain and more terrible. Fear of Sidious I. The Trade Federation does not respond to threats from unregistered. "Worf," Picard said, "the Enterprise's phaser arrays discharged in a precisely calibrated sequence that Worf and Data had spent 40 minutes calculating, not to destroy, not initially, but to demonstrate. The first shot took out the primary shield generator of the nearest Lucrehulk without breaching the hull. The second disabled its communications array. The third, delivered 3 seconds later, with the calm regularity of a metronome, collapsed its hangar bay doors, trapping every landing craft inside. 1 ship, 12 seconds, no casualties." The Trade Federation fleet held its position for exactly 4 seconds after the third shot, which was approximately the time required for the sensor data to reach every captain simultaneously and for each of them to arrive at the same conclusion. Then they began to scatter. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was geometry and physics, the Enterprise moving through the Trade Federation formation, with the agility of a vessel whose impulse drives operated on principles the Lucrehulk's navigators had never encountered. Its phaser arrays disabling shield generators and propulsion systems with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon removing obstacles rather than a warrior destroying enemies. Worf directed each shot with the controlled intensity of a Klingon who understood the difference between combat and slaughter and chose combat deliberately because slaughter required no skill and produced no honor. Data called out targeting solutions at a rate that would have overwhelmed any organic tactical officer. Geordi monitored the Enterprise's own systems with the running commentary of an engineer who loved his ship the way some people loved living things, watching for any sign that the Trade Federation's weapons, however outmatched, might find an angle worth worrying about. They did not. 18 minutes after Worf fired the first shot, the Trade Federation fleet above Naboo consisted of 11 disabled vessels holding position on emergency power, 2 that had attempted to enter hyperspace and been caught by tractor beams before they could complete the jump, and 1, Gunray's command ship, that sat intact and surrounded, its shields up, its weapons charging with the futile desperation of a cornered animal. "Viceroy," Picard said again, from his command chair, his voice carrying exactly the same measured tone it had carried before the first shot was fired. "Your fleet is disabled. Your landing craft are grounded. The planet below is no longer accessible to your forces." He folded his hands. "I would like to return to my earlier offer, which remains open." The channel from Gunray's ship was silent for a long moment. Then, "What guarantee do I have that you will protect us from?" Gunray stopped himself. "From the individual who gave you your orders?" Picard said. "None. I won't insult you with a promise I cannot keep. What I can offer is this. The United Federation of Planets does not conduct summary executions, does not accept confessions obtained under duress, and does not make deals and then break them. If you cooperate fully, you will face whatever justice this galaxy's institutions can provide, and you will face it alive." He paused. "The individual you're afraid of cannot say the same." Another silence. Longer this time. On the planet below, Picard knew, the crisis had just shifted. The immediate threat to Naboo was over. The landing craft would not come. The droid armies would stay in their bays. Queen Amidala's people would not wake tomorrow to occupation. But Palpatine's machinery was still turning. The crisis he had designed required specific outcomes, and Picard had just rearranged the board in ways the Sith Lord had not anticipated. That made the next move unpredictable, and unpredictability from someone of Palpatine's capabilities was not comfort. It was warning. "Data," Picard said quietly, while Gunray's channel remained open and the Viceroy made his calculations. "The Apprentice. Where are they?" "Based on updated transmission intercepts, Captain, the Apprentice departed Coruscant approximately 6 hours ago. Current trajectory, assuming standard hyperdrive capability, puts their arrival in the Tatooine system within." Data paused, the pause of a mind updating a calculation in real time. 14 hours. Picard looked at Naboo, then at the stars beyond it. "How long to Tatooine at maximum warp?" "At our maximum sustainable speed in this galaxy's spatial conditions, approximately 9 hours, Captain." On the view screen, Gunray finally spoke. "We will cooperate. Worf, maintain a security detail on all Trade Federation vessels," Picard said, standing. "Geordi, I want a full damage assessment and begin coordinating with Naboo's government on prisoner arrangements." He moved toward the turbolift. "Data, you're with me. We have a course to plot." He paused at the turbolift doors and looked back at the view screen, where the green curve of Naboo filled the lower half of the image, and the disabled hulks of the Trade Federation fleet drifted in silent testimony to what the 24th century looked like when it was paying attention. "And get me a channel to Queen Amidala. She deserves to know that her planet is safe." He stepped into the turbolift. "And that the danger hasn't ended." Queen Amidala received the news of her planet's salvation with the composure of someone who had been trained since childhood to hold her face still while the world moved beneath her. But Troy, monitoring the channel from the bridge, saw what the paint and ceremony concealed. A wave of relief so profound it bordered on physical, followed almost immediately by the focused intensity of a young woman who understood that survival was not the same as safety and that the enemy who sent the fleet was still at large. She was, Picard reflected, extraordinary. The Trade Federation acted on instruction, he told her directly, because she deserved directness, and because the elaborate political softening that Coruscant's culture apparently required of its diplomatic exchanges would not serve either of them here. The individual who gave those instructions is on Coruscant. We have signal intercepts, communication records, and a probability chain that connects this blockade to a deliberate political conspiracy at the highest levels of your republic's government. He paused. I will share everything we have with you, but I need you to understand what we are dealing with before you decide how to proceed. Amidala was quiet for a moment. Then, tell me, he told her. Not everything, not the Sith identification, not Data's assessment of Palpatine specifically by name, not yet, because some information required context before it could be useful, rather than merely devastating, but the architecture of it, the manufactured crisis, the engineered Senate response, the encrypted channel and its ancient origins, the fact that the blockade of Naboo had never been about Naboo. When he finished, she was still quiet. Then she said something that surprised him. I knew, she said, not the details, not the channel or the evidence. But I knew this was not about trade routes. She looked at him through the view screen with eyes that had stopped performing queenly serenity and were simply watching him with clear, direct intelligence. What do you need from me? Your authority to present this evidence to the Senate, Picard said, and your presence on Coruscant, the testimony of the Queen of Naboo, supported by independently verified intelligence from an outside party with no political interest in the outcome, will be considerably harder to dismiss than anything that could be assembled within the Republic's existing power structure. You want to take this to the Senate. I want to take this to the Senate before whoever is behind it has time to adjust their strategy. He met her gaze. We leave within the hour, Your Highness, if you're willing. My ship will escort yours to Coruscant. She nodded once, the gesture precise and final. We are willing. The Royal Naboo cruiser was a beautiful vessel, sleek, chrome-finished, built with the aesthetic sensibility of a culture that saw no reason why a functional ship should not also be a work of art. It emerged from Naboo's atmosphere like a declaration and fell into formation alongside the Enterprise with a dignity that Picard found genuinely admirable. He watched it for a moment from his command chair, then turned to what he had not yet told Queen Amidala and would not tell her over an open channel. Data. Captain, I have updated the transmission analysis with the new intercepts obtained during the engagement. I now have sufficient confidence to share an assessment I previously withheld, pending additional verification. Palpatine. Yes, Captain. Data turned from his console. The voice modulation on the encrypted channel is sophisticated, as I noted. However, voice modulation obscures biological markers. It does not obscure vocabulary, rhetorical structure, or the specific philosophical framework through which an individual processes strategic problems. These are deeply ingrained patterns that persist regardless of vocal modification. He paused. I have spent the past 6 hours compiling every public speech, Senate address, and recorded communication attributed to Supreme Chancellor Sheev Palpatine, and comparing them against the rhetorical and philosophical fingerprint of the encrypted transmission source. And the match probability is 94.7%, Captain. The individual directing the Trade Federation blockade of Naboo, the individual who appears to have engineered the political crisis that elevated him to the chancellorship, and Supreme Chancellor Sheev Palpatine of the Galactic Republic, are, in my assessment, the same person. Worf said nothing. He simply placed both hands on his tactical console with the deliberate steadiness of a warrior, confirming that his weapons were ready. Troy had gone pale. Captain, if what Data is describing is accurate, this man has access to every level of Republic government. He has been building this for years, possibly decades. Longer, Data said. The encryption architecture suggests the planning horizon for the broader strategic framework extends considerably beyond the current political situation. I am finding references in the oldest transmissions, those I assess as originating approximately 20 years prior to the current date, to a sequence of events described in terms of phases. The blockade of Naboo is Phase 1. There are references to subsequent phases. I have not yet fully decoded their content, but the terminology used is consistent with a complete restructuring of galactic governance. He's not trying to win a political argument, Picard said. He's trying to end the Republic and replace it with something else, Data confirmed. Something in which the position currently described as Supreme Chancellor holds considerably more permanent authority. The Enterprise and the Naboo cruiser slipped into hyperspace together, the swirling blue tunnel of faster-than-light travel consuming them both. And Picard used the transit time to think about everything he could not yet do, and everything he needed to do first. He needed the Senate. He needed the evidence presented in a forum that Palpatine could not immediately control or silence. He needed Amidala's voice, and his own evidence, and the particular legitimacy of an outside party whose testimony carried no political debt to anyone in this galaxy. But he also needed something else, something more immediate. He opened a channel to sickbay. "Dr. Crusher!" Beverly Crusher's voice came back, with the crisp efficiency she deployed when she was already working on something. "Captain, I need you to prepare for an away mission. Civilian rescue, potentially hostile environment, desert conditions, pre-industrial community with a significant criminal underworld element." He paused. "And Beverly, we may be bringing back a child. Possibly two." A brief silence. "Medical bay will be ready, Jean-Luc." He closed the channel and looked at the blue vortex of hyperspace, and thought about a 9-year-old boy on a desert planet who had been identified by a Sith Lord as an asset to be controlled before the people who might protect him could reach him, and about the 14 hours that stood between that boy and whatever the apprentice had been sent to do. 9 hours to Tatooine. He intended to use every one of them. Tatooine announced itself on long-range sensors as a world that had given up on comfort and committed entirely to survival. 2 suns burning in binary configuration, surface temperatures that made the ship's environmental systems register mild concern, and a civilizational footprint that data described as minimal relative to planetary surface area. Scattered settlements connected by the kind of informal infrastructure that emerged when formal governance had either never arrived or had arrived and been driven out by something worse. The something worse, in Tatooine's case, appeared to be the Hutt clan, whose organizational signature data identified in approximately 60% of the planet's commercial activity, legal and otherwise. Pre-warp, Geordi confirmed, reviewing the sensor sweep from his station. At least for the indigenous population. There's definitely off-world technology present. Starships, energy weapons, communications equipment, but it's all imported. The planet itself hasn't developed any of it. Which means the Prime Directive applies to the planet's own civilization, Picard said, but not to the off-world population operating here. "That's a fine line, Captain," Troy said. "It's a line I'm comfortable walking, Counselor, when a child's life is at stake." He turned to Data. Location of the Skywalkers. Data had been building his profile of Anakin Skywalker and his mother Shmi since leaving Coruscant's orbit, assembling a picture from the fragmentary records available in Republic databases, cross-referenced with Jedi internal communications that mentioned the boy by name with a reverence that even bureaucratic language could not entirely flatten. What emerged was not a file but a portrait, a child of extraordinary capability living in conditions of extraordinary deprivation, owned as property in a system that the Republic officially opposed and practically ignored, demonstrating mechanical and piloting abilities that defied formal explanation. Owned. The word had produced a reaction from every member of Picard's senior staff that ranged from Troy's quiet grief to Worf's barely controlled fury to Beverly Crusher's expression of the specific cold anger that doctors wore when confronted with suffering that was entirely preventable. "The Skywalkers are located in the settlement of Mos Espa," Data said. "They appear to reside in a dwelling adjacent to a junk shop operated by an individual named Watto, a Toydarian, who holds their ownership documents." He paused. "I have been examining the legal framework governing slavery on Tatooine and in the broader Outer Rim territories. The relevant documents appear to be standard commercial property records maintained in the Hutt clan's administrative system. They are, functionally, data files." Worf turned from tactical with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Data files can be modified." "Commander Worf raises an interesting point," Data said, without inflection. "The Hutt administrative system's security protocols are not beyond our capability to access. The ownership records for both Shmi Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker could, theoretically, be legally transferred and subsequently manumitted through the system's own emancipation procedure, which exists because even the Hutt clan occasionally finds it commercially advantageous to free specific individuals." Picard looked at his android officer for a long moment. "Do it," he said. "Legally, through the system's own mechanisms. I want no question about the validity of their freedom." "Understood, Captain. I will also transfer sufficient currency from the—" Data paused. "Captain, we do not carry Republic credits. What do we carry that this economy would value?" Geordi looked up from his console. Our replicators could produce gold. Gold-pressed latinum appears to be the regional currency of significant value out here. I can have several bars ready within. Do it, Picard said. Whatever it costs. Whatever Watto's records show as a fair market transaction. Pay it, document it, and ensure that every element of this is legally unimpeachable. He stood. I'll lead the away team personally. Troy started to speak. I know, he said, but this one I need to do myself. The shuttlecraft Cousteau descended through Tatooine's atmosphere in the long amber light of the binary sunset, and Picard sat in the co-pilot's seat and watched the desert spread below him in every direction, rust-colored and vast and indifferent, broken occasionally by the geometric intrusion of human settlement. It was, he thought, one of the loneliest landscapes he had ever seen, that a child of any capability, let alone this capability, had spent 9 years here, said something about the galaxy they were in that he was still processing. Worf sat behind him, armed but not conspicuously so, his Klingon frame adapted to the civilian clothing Geordi had replicated with the particular discomfort of a warrior pretending to be something other than a warrior. Crusher sat beside him with a medical kit that contained enough 24th century pharmacology to handle any contingency a desert trading post could produce. Data had remained aboard the Enterprise to monitor the apprentice's approach vector and manage the legal documentation remotely. Mos Espa was noise and smell and color compressed into narrow streets, the particular sensory density of a place where people from 100 species moved through spaces built for commerce and survival rather than comfort. Picard moved through it with the practiced neutrality of a diplomat who had walked through alien marketplaces on 6 continents and 4 quadrants, and understood that the first rule of not being noticed was not trying too hard to not be noticed. Watto's shop was easy enough to find. The Toydarian proprietor was hovering behind his counter when they entered, his wings beating with the rapid flutter of his species, his eyes moving over Picard's group with the commercial calculation of a being who had spent decades assessing customers for their purchasing power and their willingness to be cheated. We're looking for parts, Picard said pleasantly. Hyperdrive related, if you have them. And perhaps some conversation. Watto's eyes narrowed. You're not from around here. No, Picard agreed. We're not. From the back of the shop came the sound of movement. Quick, light footsteps. And then a boy appeared in the doorway between the shop and the adjoining workspace, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes going immediately to the strangers with the alert curiosity of a child who had learned to read people quickly because reading people quickly was a survival skill in Mos Espa. He was small for 9, dark-haired, sunburned, with eyes that were startlingly blue and that assessed Picard's group with an intelligence that was several years older than the face wearing it. Behind him, appearing at the doorway a moment later, was a woman whose resemblance to the boy was unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same quality of attentiveness, worn down by years of labor into something quieter but not extinguished. Picard looked at Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin Skywalker looked back at him with those blue eyes, and something passed between them in that moment that Picard could not have articulated. Some recognition that had nothing to do with prior acquaintance, and everything to do with the particular quality of the boy's attention, which was not a child's attention at all, but something that felt, absurdly, like meeting a colleague. Crusher made a small sound beside him. He knew what it meant. She felt it too. Hello, Picard said to the boy, and meant it with his whole self. My name is Jean-Luc Picard. I've come a very long way, and I have some things I'd like to discuss with you and your mother. Shmi Skywalker had survived 9 years of slavery by developing an instinct for people that was more reliable than any security system Watto had ever installed. She could read intent in the angle of a shoulder, in the quality of stillness a person carried, in the particular way someone's eyes moved when they were calculating versus when they were genuinely present. It was a skill born of necessity, when you could not leave, when the door was not yours to open. You learned to know exactly who was walking through it before they finished entering. She read Picard in approximately 4 seconds. He was not here to buy anything. He was not here to exploit anything. He was here with the specific purposeful compassion of someone who had decided to do something difficult because it was right, and the particular quality of his attention when he looked at Anakin was not the assessing gaze of someone valuing a commodity, but the careful look of someone who already knew something important and was deciding how much of it to share. She trusted him before he said another word. This frightened her slightly, because she had learned to be cautious with trust. But the fear sat alongside the trust, rather than replacing it, and she let both exist simultaneously while she listened. Watto proved to be the anticipated obstacle, and also, ultimately, a manageable one. He blustered. He inflated. He performed the elaborate theater of a merchant who considers himself to hold all the relevant cards, which was his standard opening position in any negotiation, and which collapsed with remarkable speed when Picard placed on the counter a quantity of gold-pressed latinum that represented, Data had calculated from Hutt economic records, approximately 4 times the current market valuation of both Skywalker's ownership documents, plus a legally executed transfer form already bearing the digital signatures that Data had obtained through the Hutt administrative system's own processes. Watto stared at the latinum, then at the documents, then at Picard. "This is legitimate?" he said, in a tone that suggested he found legitimacy mildly suspicious. "Completely," Picard said pleasantly. "Every element has been processed through the Hutt clan's own administrative channels. You will find the transfer recorded in their central system. The funds are real. The documentation is valid. I am simply here in person to ensure the transaction is completed properly." Watto looked at the documents for another long moment. Then he took the latinum with the speed of a being who had learned not to give generosity time to reconsider, and the thing was done. Picard turned to Shmi and Anakin and said, quietly and without ceremony, "You're free." Shmi had known it was coming. The documents, the latinum, the legal language had all pointed in one direction, but the words still did something to her face that Crusher, watching from beside the door, would later describe in her medical log as the expression of someone setting down a weight they had carried so long they had forgotten it was there. Anakin said nothing. He looked at Picard with those ancient blue eyes and seemed to be running calculations of his own, and then he said, "Why?" It was, Picard thought, exactly the right question, and it confirmed everything the boy's file had suggested about the quality of his mind. "Because you're in danger," Picard said, "and because you deserve not to be. Both things are true, and neither one is more important than the other." He crouched slightly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level with the unself-conscious ease of someone comfortable with the gesture. "There is someone who wants to find you, someone who has been watching you from a very long distance for a very long time, and whose intentions toward you are not good. I intend to make sure they don't reach you." Anakin processed this with the speed Picard was beginning to expect. "The dreams," he said. Shmi made a sharp sound. "Ani!" "It's all right," Picard said, looking up at her briefly, then back at the boy. "What dreams?" "I dream about a man in shadows," Anakin said. "I've dreamed about him since I was little. He's always watching something. I never see what, but it feels like—" He stopped, searching for language adequate to the sensation, like standing next to a furnace, hot but cold at the same time. Picard held the boy's gaze and thought about what Data had said. A Sith Lord who had been building his architecture for decades, a child identified as a generational event in terms of power. The word asset, in a transmission 1,000 years old in its encryption. The dreams were probably not coincidence. He filed that under things to discuss with the Jedi at the earliest opportunity. "Pack what matters to you," he said to Shmi. "Both of you. We won't be coming back here." The Cousteau lifted from Mos Espa 40 minutes later, and Picard sat in the cockpit and watched the desert fall away beneath them and thought about timing. Data's last update before they landed had placed the apprentice's vessel 7 hours out. They had made it with margin, but margin in a situation this fluid was not comfort. It was inventory. He opened a channel to the Enterprise. "Data, status. The apprentice's vessel has altered course, Captain." Data's voice was precise and immediate. "Upon entering the Tatooine system's outer boundary, they appear to have detected our shuttle's energy signature. They have increased speed and adjusted heading toward our current position. Time to intercept? At their current acceleration, they will enter effective weapons range of the Cousteau in approximately 43 minutes. However, at our current ascent rate, we will reach the Enterprise in 31. 12 minutes of margin." Picard looked at the 2 people sitting behind him in the shuttle's passenger compartment. A woman holding her son's hand with the careful deliberateness of someone reminding herself that the thing she was holding was real. and felt the particular quality of resolve that came to him when the arithmetic was clear and the choice had already been made. Data. I want the Enterprise positioned between our approach vector and the Apprentice's intercept course. Full shields. Weapons hot but not targeted. He paused. And hail their vessel. I'd like to have a conversation before we decide what comes next. Understood, Captain. There is one additional development. Of course there is. I have identified the Apprentice's vessel from its energy signature and hull configuration, Data said. It matches a ship type associated with a specific individual in Republic records. The vessel belongs to a Dathomirian warrior, designated as Darth Maul. Republic intelligence has no formal file on him. Jedi records contain one reference, a note by Master Qui-Gon Jinn flagging an encounter on Tatooine as a possibility given the current political situation. Data paused. Master Jinn was apparently en route to Tatooine independently, Captain. He appears to have been sent by the Jedi Council to escort Queen Amidala to Coruscant through a different routing than our own. Picard turned this over. The Jedi are already moving. Yes, and their path would have brought them to Tatooine approximately 6 hours after our current position, which, given the Apprentice's timeline, would have been too late for the Skywalkers, but potentially sufficient for Master Jinn to have encountered Darth Maul directly. Instead of which, we have the Skywalkers safely aboard and an armed Sith operative bearing down on our position 12 minutes before we reach the ship. That is an accurate summary, Captain. Picard looked at the stars emerging above Tatooine's atmosphere as the shuttle broke the upper boundary of the sky, and beyond them, the familiar shape of the Enterprise holding station against the dark, solid, and certain, and impossibly far from home. And he felt something he rarely allowed himself in the middle of an operation. A brief, clean flash of gratitude that it was this ship, this crew, in this moment. One more thing, Data. Captain, when we dock, make sure Anakin gets to see the bridge. A pause. From behind him, Picard heard a sound that might, on a boy who had spent his entire life on a desert planet dreaming of the stars, be described as the specific quality of breath that preceded wonder. I will ensure the turbo lift is ready, Captain, Data said. And if an android could smile, Data's voice came very close to it. Darth Maul had been trained since childhood to be a weapon, not a soldier, not an operative, not an agent in the conventional sense that intelligence organizations use the word, but a weapon in the philosophical meaning, something forged with singular purpose, every element of its construction oriented toward a single function. Maul did not have missions in the way that a Republic intelligence officer had missions. He had targets. He had timelines. He had the absolute certainty of a being who had never been permitted to doubt and had consequently never developed the capacity for it. The Enterprise confused him. This was not an emotional state he had significant experience with, and he processed it the way he processed most things, as a tactical variable to be eliminated through information. His vessel's sensors could not adequately characterize the ship blocking his approach to Tatooine. Its hull configuration matched nothing in any database he carried. Its energy output suggested weapons systems of a category that had no classification in Sith intelligence files, and it had moved, deliberately, precisely, to place itself between his intercept vector and the shuttle ascending from the planet's surface. Someone had taken the asset. He opened a channel, because Lord Sidious had taught him that information gathered before commitment to action was always preferable to information gathered after, and because the voice that hailed him from the unknown vessel had the specific quality of command authority that he had learned, over years of watching his master operate, to treat as a variable worth assessing before dismissing. Picard's face appeared on his view screen, and Maul studied it with the flat, predatory attention he gave everything. The age in it, the intelligence, the particular quality of stillness that distinguished people who had been in genuine danger many times from people who merely thought they had. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard, of the USS Enterprise, the human said. I believe you've come for the people aboard my shuttle. I'm inviting you to reconsider. Maul said nothing. Silence was information, too. The boy and his mother are under my protection, Picard continued, with the unhurried clarity of someone who was not performing confidence but simply had it. Whatever instructions you were given regarding them are no longer executable. I am giving you the opportunity to withdraw, because the alternative serves neither of us. He paused. I know who sent you. I know what you are. And I know that what I'm offering you, the chance to leave, is considerably more than your master would extend to anyone in a comparable position. On the bridge of the Enterprise, the tension was the specific kind that came not from uncertainty about outcome, but from the weight of what the outcome would cost if it went wrong. Worf stood at tactical, with the controlled readiness of a Klingon who had made his peace with the present moment. Data monitored Maul's vessel with continuous sensor sweeps, updating his threat assessment every 1.3 seconds. Troy stood beside Picard's empty chair. He was at the communications console, having chosen to conduct this conversation standing, and focused every betazoid sense she possessed on the channel. "He's not afraid," she said quietly. "Not of us. There's calculation, frustration, and something underneath both of those that feels like—" She stopped. "Like what?" Worf said. "Like someone who has never been given a choice before and doesn't know what to do with one." Maul's response, when it came, was not words. His vessel accelerated. It was fast, genuinely fast, built for exactly this kind of aggressive approach, and Maul flew it with the instinctive precision of someone for whom a ship was an extension of his own body, rather than a machine he was operating. He came in at an angle that most pilots would not have attempted, using Tatooine's gravitational influence to slingshot through a trajectory that compressed his approach time and complicated a targeting solution. It was, objectively, an impressive piece of flying. It was also insufficient. "Tractor beam," Picard said, and Geordi was already on it. The beam caught Maul's vessel at the apex of its slingshot maneuver, at the precise moment when its own momentum was committed and its maneuvering thrusters had the least leverage against an external force. The ship shuddered, spun partially, and then held, caught in the tractor beam's grip with the particular helplessness of something designed to move fast, suddenly made to hold still. Maul cut his engines and sat in the grip of a technology he had no counter for, and Picard watched the sensor readings from his vessel and waited. The Cousteau docked. Picard heard through his earpiece the brief, controlled sound of Worf's security team meeting the shuttle in the bay, and Beverly Crusher's voice telling someone, Anakin, it had to be Anakin, that the slight dizziness he was feeling was just the transition from the shuttle's artificial gravity to the ship's, and it would pass in a moment. He kept his eyes on Maul's vessel. "Captain," Data said, "his weapon systems are powering down, not surrender." Picard knew it was not surrender. Nothing in Maul's profile suggested surrender as a concept he possessed. It was assessment. The weapon, finding itself in a situation its construction had not accounted for, was recalibrating, trying to find an angle. "Keep the tractor beam," Picard said, "but don't bring him aboard, not yet." He opened the channel again. "I want to tell you something," he said to Maul, and kept his voice entirely free of triumph, because triumph in this moment would have been both tactically foolish and personally dishonest. There was nothing triumphant about a young man who had been turned into this. "The individual who sent you here does not intend for you to survive long enough to become inconvenient. The people who built you into what you are, the moment you are no longer useful, you will be discarded. I have seen this pattern before. I have seen it across 100 civilizations in my own galaxy. It is the oldest story that power tells about itself." Silence from Maul's vessel. "I am not asking you to change sides," Picard continued. "I'm not certain you can. I am asking you to consider the possibility that you were lied to. Not about tactics, not about missions, but about your own value to the people who trained you." He paused. "That's a harder thing to consider. I know, but I'm asking anyway." Troy was watching the sensor readouts that tracked the biochemical signatures Data had isolated from Maul's vessel. She said nothing, but her expression changed, subtly, in the way that meant she was receiving something she had not expected. Picard looked at her. She shook her head slowly. Not negation, something more complex, something she would need to find words for later, when the immediate moment had passed and there was space to be precise. Maul's channel opened. When he spoke, his voice was not what Picard had expected, not the rage that his physical appearance and training history suggested, but something that lived underneath the rage, something older and more complicated that had perhaps never been addressed directly before this moment. "The boy," Maul said. "What will happen to him?" It was not quite a question. It was close to one. Picard answered it with the directness he had used with Amidala, because it was what the moment required. "He will be free. His mother will be free. What they do with that freedom is theirs to decide." He met the blank visual of the closed-channel camera, as if he could see through it to the being on the other side. That is what freedom is. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Worf began quietly recalculating weapons solutions. Then Maul's vessel went fully dark, not powered down, but running minimal systems, the signature of a ship that had decided to wait. It was not an answer, but it was not an attack. Picard turned to his crew. Data, compile everything. Every intercept, every probability chain, every signal trace. Format it for Senate presentation. I want nothing that can be challenged on procedural grounds. He looked at the view screen, where Coruscant waited somewhere beyond the stars, and where a man who had spent decades building his architecture of domination was about to discover that someone had walked through the walls he thought were invisible. We go to Coruscant. He paused. And someone tell Anakin that yes, he can see the warp core. Coruscant from orbit was the most ambitious thing Picard had ever seen a civilization do to a planet. Every continent consumed, every natural surface replaced. Layer upon layer of city built upon the bones of previous city, reaching down into geological strata and upward into the lower atmosphere, illuminated from within by the constant light of trillions of lives proceeding simultaneously in every direction. It was, objectively, a monument to what sentient life could accomplish when it organized itself at sufficient scale and maintained that organization across sufficient time. It was also, Picard thought, looking at the Senate District's gleaming towers through the viewport of the Naboo cruiser's conference room, an extraordinarily good place to hide. The plan had been constructed during the transit from Tatooine with the methodical precision that Picard's senior staff brought to every problem. Data organizing the evidence architecture, Troy analyzing the political landscape of the Senate for pressure points and vulnerabilities, Worf assessing security implications with the strategic instinct of a warrior who understood that the battlefield they were entering was made of language and procedure rather than weapons, but was no less dangerous for that. Queen Amidala had participated in every session, contributing a knowledge of Republic political mechanics that proved invaluable, and a quality of focused determination that Picard found himself increasingly admiring. She had also, somewhere over the long transit, made a decision that she had not announced, but that Troy had sensed and Picard had confirmed by simply watching her face during the final planning session. She was going to present this evidence herself, in the full chamber, as a queen addressing a Senate that had failed her planet, and she was going to do it with the particular authority of someone who had nothing left to lose politically and everything to gain morally. Picard had told her it was the right call. She had thanked him with the precision of someone who did not thank people casually. The Senate chamber was vast in the way that only structures built to hold power could be vast, a sphere of tiered floating platforms, each carrying a delegation from a member world, the whole assembly oriented toward a central podium that could rise and descend hydraulically, bringing speakers to the attention of the full body. It smelled of recycled air and old ambition. The acoustics were extraordinary. Every word spoken from the central platform reached every platform simultaneously with perfect clarity, which meant that what was about to be said would be heard by every delegation in the chamber without the possibility of selective transmission or edited relay. Data had confirmed the acoustics before they entered. He had also confirmed that the evidence package was already distributed, copies transmitted simultaneously to the offices of 47 senior senators, the offices of the Jedi Council, the Republic Judicial Department, and 6 independent journalistic organizations, time to arrive at the moment Amidala began speaking. Whatever happened in the chamber, the information was already beyond anyone's ability to contain. Palpatine met them in the antechamber. He was exactly what his public profile suggested, and nothing like what his private transmissions revealed. Warm, avuncular, radiating the specific kind of benevolent concern that powerful people deployed when they wanted to appear less powerful than they were. He embraced Amidala with the practiced affection of a mentor greeting a protege, expressed his profound relief at her safety, turned to Picard with an expression of genuine appearing curiosity, and extended his hand, and felt nothing unusual because he was not force-sensitive and had no mechanism for detecting whatever it was that radiated from the man beyond the evidence Data had compiled and his own considerable experience reading people who were pretending to be something other than what they were. But Troy, standing 2 steps behind him, went very still. Later, she would describe it as standing next to a sun that had learned to look like a candle, a presence so vast and carefully contained that the containment itself was the most frightening thing about it. The discipline required to hold that much darkness behind that much warmth, maintained across every interaction, every Senate session, every public appearance, for years, possibly decades. The effort of it was, she said, almost incomprehensible, and underneath the effort, steady and patient and absolute, was something she had no word for in any language she spoke. The closest she could come was appetite. Palpatine looked at Picard with warm eyes and said, "Captain, the Republic owes you a debt it may not know how to repay. You have preserved one of our most beloved member worlds and ensured the safety of our Queen. Whatever you need during your time here, please consider the full resources of the Chancellery at your disposal." "That's very generous," Picard said pleasantly. "I hope to be able to speak with you privately before we leave. I have some questions I think only you can answer." Something moved behind Palpatine's eyes. It was gone in a fraction of a second, replaced immediately by the warm concern of a chancellor grateful for an ally. But it had been there, and Picard had been watching for it, and he had seen it. Not fear, something colder than fear. Recalculation. The Senate session began 1 hour later. Amidala rose to the central platform with the bearing of someone who had decided that bearing was the most powerful thing she owned. She presented the evidence without theatrical escalation, without the emotional appeals that Senate rhetoric typically favored. She presented it the way Picard had presented it to her, as a chain of verified facts connected by clear logical inference, supported by signal intercepts that Data's name and credentials were attached to as primary analyst, documented by a source with no political interest in this galaxy and therefore no incentive to fabricate. The Chamber's response was not the immediate uproar Picard had half expected. It was something quieter and in some ways more significant. The specific silence of a very large number of people simultaneously encountering information that required them to reorganize their understanding of the recent past. Picard watched from the diplomatic gallery. He watched Palpatine, on his Chancellor's platform, receive the evidence with an expression of progressive and beautifully performed shock, the face of a man being told something that devastated him, every micro-expression calibrated to read as genuine to an observer who did not know what Troy had felt in the antechamber. It was, Picard thought, one of the most accomplished performances he had ever witnessed, which was itself a kind of evidence, but evidence of a kind that courts required corroboration for. What courts could work with was Data's signal analysis, the transmission records, the encryption matching, the rhetorical fingerprint assessment at 94.7% probability, the timeline of the Chancellor's elevation mapped against the construction of the communication infrastructure that had preceded it. Not proof beyond every doubt, but sufficient for investigation, sufficient for the machinery of Republic law to begin turning in a direction it had never previously been pointed. Sufficient, Picard had concluded, was what they had come here to achieve. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours. Picard did not stay for all of it. He spent 2 of those hours in a private meeting with Masters Mace Windu and Yoda of the Jedi Council, who had received Data's evidence package simultaneously with the Senate and who asked questions with the particular quality of minds that were already running several parallel assessments. Yoda, especially, sat with the information in a silence that felt less like processing and more like listening to something beyond the room. Known, this was not, Yoda said finally. And yet, he paused, felt, it has been, a shadow, difficult to see. The dark side clouds everything. The dark side, Picard said carefully, is considerably easier to see when you're not inside it. Yoda looked at him with ancient eyes, and what passed across his face was not quite amusement and not quite grief, but something that contained elements of both. Outside perspective, he said. Valuable this is. More valuable than we have known how to ask for. The investigation was formally opened before the Senate session closed. An independent judicial commission, proposed by a coalition of senators who had received the evidence package and had the political courage to act on it, was appointed with a mandate that explicitly included the Chancellery's communications infrastructure. Palpatine accepted the commission's formation with gracious public support and the specific quality of composure that Picard recognized as a man who had contingency plans for this exact scenario and was already executing them. It was not over. Picard understood this completely. The architecture Palpatine had built was deep and patient, and designed to survive disruption. A Senate investigation, however legitimate, was not the end of the Sith's long game. It was a complication, a significant one, the kind that altered timelines and forced recalculation, but a complication nonetheless, in the hands of someone who had been recalculating for decades. What it was, irrevocably, was public. The information existed now outside any single point of control. It was in the files of 47 senators and 6 journalistic organizations and the Jedi Council and the Republic Judicial Department. It was in the testimony of Queen Amidala, whose credibility the Senate would not easily dismiss. It was in Data's analysis, which Picard had ensured was formatted to meet the evidentiary standards of any advanced civilization's legal system, because he had consulted with Data on exactly that question during the transit, and Data had obliged with his customary thoroughness. The shadow had been named. Naming shadows did not destroy them, but it changed what they could do. Picard returned to the Enterprise as Coruscant's artificial day cycle shifted toward evening, the planet's trillion lights beginning their nightly performance below, and he stood on his bridge and looked at the view screen and allowed himself one quiet moment of assessment before the next problem presented itself. Shmi Skywalker was in Beverly Crusher's care, receiving treatment for years of accumulated physical strain that Federation medicine could address in days. Anakin was somewhere in the ship. The last report from Geordi had included the phrase, "He's been in the engine room for 3 hours, and I think he understands the warp core better than some of my ensigns," delivered with a combination of exasperation and genuine awe that told Picard everything he needed to know about the boy. Maul's vessel was still in tractor beam containment. Maul himself had not spoken again since Tatooine, but he had not attempted to escape, and Data's sensor readings of the vessel showed a being sitting in stillness that was different from the coiled readiness of a weapon waiting to deploy. What it was instead, Picard could not say with certainty. But Troy had used the word thinking and had said it with the careful tone she reserved for things that surprised her. The intelligence file on Darth Sidious, complete, verified, formatted for legal proceeding, sat in the Jedi Council's secured archive and in the Republic's judicial system and in the private communications of enough senators to make its suppression practically impossible. It was, in the end, not a victory. Not yet. Possibly not for years. The machine Palpatine had built was old and deep, and would not be dismantled by a single Senate session or a single intelligence file. The Force, whatever it was, still moved through this galaxy in patterns that Picard could not read, and that the Jedi themselves admitted they could not fully see. But a boy who had been identified as an asset to be controlled was tonight eating replicated food in a Federation starship's mess hall and asking Lieutenant Commander Data whether the concept of faster-than-light travel was theoretically compatible with the physics of something called the Force. And Data was answering with the patient enthusiasm he reserved for genuinely interesting questions, and Shmi Skywalker was sleeping in a medical bay without chains for the first time in 9 years. Picard thought about what Yoda had said. Outside perspective. Valuable this is. He thought about a prime directive that had been written to protect civilizations from interference, and about how the same ethical framework that prevented Starfleet from contaminating a developing world also demanded that a civilization capable of faster-than-light travel be engaged as a peer, met honestly, treated with the full weight of the Federation's moral commitment, not observed from a careful distance while it was consumed from within. He thought about Palpatine in the antechamber, shaking his hand with warm eyes and cold calculation, already running contingencies. The work was not done. It was barely begun. But the light was on, and the shadow knew it. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Republic would never be quite the same. The Judicial Commission's investigation moved slowly, as institutions always did, but it moved, each document, each signal intercept, each testimony building a record that Palpatine's machinery struggled to suppress from within a system that now knew to watch for the suppression. The Jedi Council, armed with a clarity they had not possessed the day before, began looking at the shadow they had felt for years, with new eyes and new tools. They did not yet see everything, but they saw more. Shmi Skywalker, freed by Federation medicine from the physical accumulation of 9 years of slavery, chose to remain near her son as he entered Jedi training. a condition that Master Yoda accepted with less resistance than tradition might have predicted. As if the ancient master understood that this particular child's path required a foundation that the Order's orthodoxy had not previously been asked to provide. Anakin himself, extraordinary, restless, already asking questions that made his instructors pause, would remember for the rest of his life the 3 days he spent aboard a starship from another galaxy, walking corridors that hummed with a different kind of power than anything the Force described, talking with a golden android who answered every question without condescension, and standing on a bridge beside a man who looked at a conspiracy that had been building for decades and said, "The Enterprise found its way home eventually. The subspace anomaly that had displaced them could be recreated under controlled conditions, data determined, and the journey back took 11 days and required modifications to the deflector array that Geordi described afterward as the most interesting engineering problem of his career." Picard filed a complete report with Starfleet Command. It was classified at the highest level and read by people who spent a long time sitting with it before deciding what it meant for Federation policy. And somewhere in the records of the Jedi Archive, alongside ancient texts and kyber crystal maps and the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 generations of Force practitioners, sat a data chip containing a complete intelligence analysis in a format no one in the galaxy had seen before. Precise, comprehensive, and signed by a Starfleet officer who had come from beyond the stars and left behind the most dangerous thing a conspiracy can face: the truth, documented and distributed beyond anyone's power to take back.